On Christmas Eve, I had only $20 left for my twin girls, so I ordered one chicken dinner and divided it between them. Mommy ate earlier, I lied. Then a little boy at the next table stared at my empty plate and whispered to his father, "Dad, why isn't their mom eating?" Moments later, he walked toward our table and made an offer I was almost too proud to accept. What happened after I said yes changed all 5 of our lives. Christmas Eve, I sat in the corner of a small diner with my twin girls, trying not to touch the $20 bill folded inside my coat pocket. I had already read the menu 3 times. Everything looked ordinary until I started adding the prices in my head. If I ordered 2 meals, we would not have enough left for the bus ride home. So I ordered 1 chicken dinner. When the plate arrived, the smell of roasted chicken and warm potatoes filled the space between us. I picked up the knife. It scraped softly against the plate as I cut the chicken into smaller pieces. 1 for Lucy, 1 for Emily. I divided the potatoes between them and pushed the vegetables toward the middle. Lucy looked at my empty side of the plate. "Mommy, aren't you eating?" I smiled. "Mommy ate earlier." Emily looked at me for a few seconds too long. She knew. That hurt more than the hunger. I was not afraid of missing dinner. I was afraid my daughters were beginning to understand that I could not give them what they needed. Near the fireplace, a little boy had stopped eating. He kept looking toward our table. Then he leaned toward the man beside him. "Dad, why isn't their mom eating?" The man followed his gaze. For one awful second, I wanted to disappear. Then the boy asked, "Can they eat with us?" The man simply nodded. A moment later, the boy stood beside our table. He said his name was Noah. Then he explained that they had too much food and we could share theirs. My first instinct was to say no, not because I wasn't hungry, because pity had become harder for me to swallow than hunger. Then Lucy looked at me. Emily said nothing, but her small hand closed around mine. They were waiting. I said yes. As I stood up, I felt the crumpled $20 in my pocket again, and my mind slipped back over the weeks that had brought us there. My last steady job had ended. My savings had nearly disappeared. Their father had long since chosen a life that did not include us. Rent was coming due, and I had already cut everything I knew how to cut. Years later, I realized poverty has a strange way of making ordinary choices feel like moral decisions. That night, even ordering dinner felt like choosing which necessity we could live without. Noah led us across the room. His father stood and pulled out 3 chairs. He wore a plain sweater and jeans. No flashy watch. Nothing about him suggested wealth. I still did not know who he was. I thought the greatest gift that night would be a hot meal. I was wrong. But the next morning, when I opened our refrigerator, the miracle of Christmas Eve already felt very far away. The refrigerator hummed softly as I stared at 3 eggs, half a carton of milk, a box of pasta, and 1 jar of tomato sauce. That was Christmas morning. The night before had been warm. For a few hours, Emily and Lucy had laughed over a real dinner with Noah and his father. But Christmas morning had a way of making reality visible again. Bills did not disappear because someone had been kind to us. I closed the refrigerator and heard small footsteps behind me. Lucy came into the kitchen first, still rubbing her eyes. Emily followed a few seconds later. They went straight to the little artificial tree in the living room. There was nothing underneath it. I had prepared myself for that moment. It still hurt when Lucy asked, "Mommy, where are the presents?" I sat beside them. I did not tell them Santa had forgotten us. I could not put that kind of sadness on a stranger in a red suit. I told them this Christmas was going to be different. We would stay together, watch old movies, make something warm to eat, and spend the day as a family. Emily disappeared into the bedroom. She came back carrying 2 folded cards. Hers showed 3 people holding hands beneath a crooked yellow sun. Lucy's card had glitter everywhere, including on the kitchen floor and somehow on her own cheek. They had made them for me. I almost cried. Instead, I hugged them both until Lucy complained that I was squeezing too hard. Later, while they watched television, I sat at the kitchen table with my rent notice, utility bill, checking account balance, and a calendar. The math was simple. Rent. Food. Bus fare. I could cover 2, comfortably. The third would suffer. People often think the hardest part of being broke is wanting things you can't buy. It isn't. The hardest part is having to decide which responsibility gets disappointed first. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Helen from across the hall stood there holding a small tin of Christmas cookies. She asked whether the girls were having a good morning, then quietly told me that if I ever needed a few hours for a job interview, she could watch them. My first instinct was to refuse. Pride had become a habit, so I only said I would keep it in mind. That afternoon, I pulled out an old notebook. On a clean page, I wrote 2 words. Find work. Then beneath them, I added 2 more. Don't quit. I called every place where I had already left my name. No openings. No callbacks. Try again after the holidays. That night, I laid my cleanest clothes across the bed and chose the best pair of shoes I had left. The next morning, I decided I would hear as many no's as it took to find one yes. The first cafe said no before I had finished explaining my experience. The pharmacy was kinder. The woman behind the counter took my resume, looked it over, and told me they might be hiring after New Year's. The clothing store was different. The manager glanced at Emily and Lucy standing beside me, then looked back at my resume. Do you have reliable availability? I knew what she meant. She wasn't really asking about my schedule. She was asking whether 2 little girls would make me a problem. For a second, I wanted to explain everything. I wanted to tell her I had worked sick before, that I had balanced jobs, appointments, grocery lists, school forms, fevers, and rent notices without anyone stepping in for me. But I wasn't there to win an argument. I needed a job. So I nodded politely. Thank you for your time. Then I took my daughter's hands and walked out. We kept going. A small grocery store said they were fully staffed. The bookstore would not even take my resume. A restaurant manager told me to come back in January. Lucy thought we were downtown to see the Christmas decorations. She stopped at every window covered in lights and pointed at plastic reindeer, silver stars, and fake snow. Emily was quieter. She had begun to understand. Every time I walked back out of a business with the same folder still in my hand, she looked at my face before asking anything. By late afternoon, my feet hurt inside my worn shoes. The cold had worked through my coat, and I had heard the word no so many times it had stopped sounding like a word. After the last restaurant turned me away, I stepped onto the sidewalk and simply stopped. I didn't cry. I just couldn't make my legs move for a few seconds. Emily slipped her small hand into mine. We're okay, Mommy. I looked down at her. That was when I understood how much my daughters had been seeing, while I was busy pretending they saw nothing. There was a time when I thought dignity meant never letting anyone see you struggle. That afternoon, I began to wonder if dignity might mean continuing even after they did. Lucy suddenly spotted a fountain covered in blue and white lights and hurried toward it. I lifted my head to call her back. Then I heard a familiar voice. Emily! Lucy! Noah was running toward us. Daniel followed a few steps behind. He looked at me. Not at my old coat. Not at my shoes. At me. Is everything okay? The answer came automatically. I'm fine. I stopped. For once, I decided not to hide behind those words. Actually, no, I'm not. Actually, no, I'm not. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence. He just stood beside me while Noah, Emily, and Lucy chased each other around the fountain. So I told him the truth. I had spent the day looking for work. Rent was coming due. Groceries were almost gone. Every place I walked into seemed to have the same answer. Come back after the holidays. I gave a tired laugh. I wish I could tell my landlord to come back in January. Daniel didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't offer to fix everything. He just listened. That mattered more than I expected. A few minutes later, Noah ran over with Emily and Lucy behind him. "Dad, can they come over?" Daniel looked at me before answering. "Only if their mom is comfortable with it." It was a small thing, but I noticed. He didn't assume. He didn't decide for me. I looked at my girls. Lucy was practically bouncing. Even Emily looked excited. So I said yes. Daniel's house sat in a quiet neighborhood away from downtown. It was large and beautiful, but not the kind of place that felt designed to impress strangers. What struck me first was the silence. Before the kids ran upstairs, I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator and the click of the heating system. Then Noah opened his bedroom door. Within minutes, laughter rolled down the staircase. Toys clattered across the floor. Lucy shouted something about a race. Emily laughed so hard I barely recognized the sound. The house changed. My apartment was small. The windows leaked cold air, and every room showed its age. But it was never silent. Daniel had space, comfort, and more than enough. Yet standing in his kitchen, I began to understand that having more did not mean having everything. He made coffee. The spoon touched the side of my mug with a soft clink. We talked, but he never asked how much money I had left. He never asked how far behind I was. He never asked about the girl's father. He let me decide what parts of my life belonged in the room. I had spent years thinking safety meant having no one close enough to hurt me. Sitting in that quiet kitchen, I wondered if maybe safety could also mean being near someone who didn't demand anything. When we finally left, I noticed Daniel's car again, his house, the neighborhood. I knew he was doing well. I had no idea how well. At the door, he said, "If you need a hand, ask." I looked at him. "Why?" He gave a small shrug. "Because sometimes people are allowed to help each other." I carried that sentence home with me. And I still had no idea who Daniel really was. 2 days after we visited Daniel's house, he sent me a message. Noah had been asking about Emily and Lucy, and Daniel wondered if we wanted to meet at a neighborhood park that afternoon. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to go. I did. That was what made me nervous. The girls were thrilled. Within minutes, the three of them were racing across the playground, taking turns on the swings, and arguing over tag as if they had known each other for years. Daniel and I sat on a bench nearby. Then he asked, "How are you holding up?" "Better today." It was true, but only partly. I told him what scared me most was not the missing toys or the old apartment. It was the possibility that one day Emily and Lucy would look back on their childhood and remember a mother who was always worried about money, a mother checking prices, a mother whispering over bills, a mother saying, "Maybe next week." Daniel listened before answering. "Love doesn't pay rent. You're right. But the fact that you know that is exactly why you keep looking for a way forward." That stayed with me. He did not pretend love solved everything. He understood that loving my daughters was why I refused to stop trying. A cold gust moved through the park. I folded my arms against it. Daniel took off his jacket and held it toward me. I started to refuse. He did not argue. He placed it beside me. A minute later, I picked it up and put it over my shoulders. That small choice meant more than I wanted to admit. I was beginning to understand that I did not hate being helped. I hated feeling indebted. Those were not the same thing. Pride had kept me standing for years, but I was beginning to understand that the same pride that protects you in bad times can become a wall when better people finally arrive. What drew me toward Daniel was not his house or his car. It was the way he watched Noah without hovering. The way he kept his word, the way he never turned kindness into leverage. That frightened me, because trust was starting to feel possible. Before we left, Daniel asked if the girls and I wanted to come for dinner the next evening. I hesitated. Emily stayed quiet. Lucy did not. "Can we, Mommy?" I looked at the children, waiting for my answer. Then I said yes. That dinner was the night I finally told Daniel why I didn't trust men. I just didn't expect him to answer with a story almost as painful as mine. Dinner the next evening was simple. Daniel made pasta, grilled chicken, salad, and garlic bread. I was surprised by how comfortable he looked in the kitchen. When I mentioned it, he smiled and told me his father had never believed money should excuse a person from knowing how ordinary things worked. My father believed a man shouldn't own a building if he didn't know how to fix a leaking faucet. After dinner, the kids went upstairs to play. The house grew quiet again. Daniel asked about the girl's father carefully, almost as if he was giving me permission not to answer. This time, I chose to. I told him that when I found out I was pregnant with twins, the man I had trusted began pulling away. Calls became shorter. Visits became excuses. Eventually, he disappeared altogether. He never screamed at me. He never made some dramatic speech. He simply chose not to stay. That had been worse in its own way. After that, I stopped trusting promises, I told Daniel. Promises are easy when nobody has to prove them yet. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he told me about Noah's mother. She had left too. Daniel had learned how to raise a baby before he was ready. He had money for hospital bills, childcare when he needed it, and a safe home. But money could not sit beside a feverish child at 2 a.m. It could not answer Noah when he eventually asked why his mother was gone. And it could not make a large house feel less empty. I used to think money divided people into those who had problems and those who didn't. Daniel taught me something more complicated. Money could change the size of a problem. It couldn't always change the place where it hurt. Then he told me the rest. His family owned businesses and properties. He had inherited money, built investments, and managed more wealth than I had imagined. I stared at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because that wasn't the first thing I wanted you to know about me." I leaned back slightly. Suddenly, the distance between our lives felt larger. Daniel noticed. But he did not offer to pay my rent. He did not offer groceries. He did not tell me to move into his house. He let the silence stay where it was. The next morning, his message appeared on my phone. It was a job posting for Morning Light Cafe. "They posted this yesterday. If you want it, apply. I can help you make your resume clearer. But the interview has to be yours." I read that last sentence twice. The interview has to be yours. For the first time in years, someone was offering me help without asking me to surrender control. I opened my old resume and realized the next person I had to convince wasn't Daniel. It was me. The interview had to be mine. The next morning, I sat at Mrs. Helen's kitchen table with my resume in front of me. Daniel had helped me clean up the wording the night before, but I was the one who emailed it to Morning Light Cafe. Mrs. Helen watched Emily and Lucy while I went downtown alone. Margaret Collins studied my resume without smiling. 5 years away from steady work, why should I believe you can handle one of our lunch shifts? I kept my hands folded in my lap. Those years were not empty. I told her I had raised 2 children, managed schedules, stretched money, handled emergencies, and worked before that in food service, inventory, cashiering, and customer service. She listened, Then she offered me one trial shift. Nothing more. By noon, the cafe was packed. One employee had called in sick, so I was given more tables than expected. Plates moved in every direction. The printer kept spitting out tickets. Someone in the kitchen made one of my orders wrong. A man at table 12 blamed me anyway. I apologized and took the plate back. When I returned with the corrected order, he looked at the people sitting with him and said loudly, "If you can't keep up, maybe you should stay home with your kids." For 1 second, every old humiliation came back. The worn coat. The resume gap. The way people heard single mother and sometimes decided they already knew the rest of my story. I could have answered him. Instead, I said, "I'll correct your order, sir." Then I walked away. I had finally learned that silence and weakness were not the same thing. Sometimes silence was simply refusing to hand someone else control over your behavior. I thought that would be the worst moment of the day. I was wrong. At closing, the shift supervisor counted my cash drawer, then counted it again. $40 was missing. She looked at me. "You were the new person on this register." The meaning was clear. My stomach tightened, but I stayed where I was. Before anyone decides what happened, can we check the transactions? During the lunch rush, Margaret had handled a cash refund on my register. I remembered the amount. $40. We opened the point of sale log. The refund was there. Wrong drawer. Wrong entry. I had taken nothing. The supervisor said nothing. Margaret looked at me differently. Being poor had taught me to keep receipts, remember numbers, and know exactly where every dollar went. That habit had once felt humiliating. That afternoon it protected me. After the cafe closed, Margaret asked me to follow her into the office. She shut the door, placed my resume on the desk, and pointed to the chair. "Sit down, Rachel. We need to talk about what happened today. If you are still listening, please leave a comment below, sharing your level of satisfaction, so I know there are companions joining me on this journey. Your presence is the greatest source of encouragement for me to continue and share the final part." I sat across from Margaret, convinced she was about to tell me my trial shift was over. Instead, she placed the point of sale report on the desk between us. "You handled today better than people who have worked here for years." I wasn't sure I had heard her correctly. Margaret tapped the report once. "You said you could handle pressure. You weren't exaggerating." Then she told me Morning Light wanted me on the schedule. A real job, regular hours, not another promise to call me after the holidays. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She had seen the gap in my resume. She had seen me make mistakes during a brutal lunch rush. She had also seen what I did after those mistakes. I stayed. I fixed what I could. And when someone questioned my honesty, I found the facts. Margaret was not hiring me because she felt sorry for my daughters. She was hiring me because I had shown her I could do the work. That difference meant everything. When I stepped outside, Daniel was waiting across the street near his car. He had stayed away from the cafe, just as he promised. He looked at my face. "You got it?" That was when the tears came. Not many. Just enough that I had to laugh at myself while wiping them away. "I got it." Daniel smiled. "You got it. I didn't." I looked at him carefully. "Did you call Margaret?" "No." He told me he had only seen the job posting. He had not called the owner, mentioned his name, or asked anyone for a favor. I believed him. And standing there on that cold sidewalk, something shifted inside me. The job was mine. Not borrowed, not arranged. Mine. For years, I thought confidence was something people either had or didn't. I was wrong. Sometimes confidence is just evidence collected slowly, one difficult thing you survive after another. The first week did not suddenly make life easy. I still counted bus fare before leaving home. I packed my own lunch. I wore the same old shoes. At the grocery store, I still checked my bank balance before putting anything extra in the cart. But now there was one difference. A paycheck was coming. When I finally received that first paycheck, I sat at my kitchen table and held it longer than necessary. It was not a fortune, but it had come from my work, my hours, my name. And the first thing I bought with it wasn't something I needed. The first thing I bought with my paycheck was a box of strawberries. It happened on an ordinary grocery trip. Emily and Lucy walked beside the cart while I picked up milk, eggs, chicken, vegetables, and cereal. I still moved through the store the same way I always had, checking prices before placing anything in the cart. Then Lucy stopped beside the produce section. "Mommy, can we get strawberries?" I looked at the price tag automatically. The answer almost came out before I thought about it. Maybe next week. For years, those words had been my way of softening no. But I stood there for a moment and did the math again. Rent was already set aside. The grocery budget was covered. My next paycheck was coming. I reached for the strawberries and placed them in the cart. Lucy smiled. That was all. No miracle, no mansion. No expensive car waiting outside, just a small plastic box of fruit that I could buy without wondering whether it would cost us bus fare later. And somehow, that felt enormous. Life became steadier after that. Daniel stopped offering practical help unless I asked. He never showed up with groceries. He did not pay my bills or buy things I could not afford. He simply kept showing up. Sometimes he and Noah came over for dinner. Sometimes we met at the park. On weekends, the kids worked on school projects together or argued over movies, while Daniel and I cleaned up after them. The more independent I became, the more I noticed something I had missed before. Daniel was still there. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep in the living room, I looked at him. "You know I can handle things now." "I know. And you're still here." He gave me a quiet smile. That was always the point. We did not kiss. We did not need to. For years, I had wondered who would stay if I stopped being useful, agreeable, or easy to love. With Daniel, I slowly began asking a different question. Who stays when you no longer need saving? Several months passed. My rent was current. The refrigerator stayed stocked. I had even started a small emergency fund. For the first time, stability no longer felt temporary. Then one evening, Daniel offered me something I had once dreamed of desperately, a safer home, and I said no. By then, Daniel and I had known each other for months. The girls were comfortable in his house. Noah treated them like family. I knew the quiet streets around his neighborhood, the way the evening light came through the kitchen windows, and which floorboard outside Noah's room made a soft sound when someone stepped on it. One evening, after dinner, Daniel told me something simply. If I wanted Emily, Lucy, and I could move in. There was no ring, no deadline, no speech about how much easier my life would be. He just made the offer and left the decision with me. I looked around the house. There were warm bedrooms, safe sidewalks, windows that closed properly, a kitchen where I never had to wonder if the heat would stay on. Months earlier, I would have prayed for something like that. Now, I surprised both of us. Not yet. Daniel stayed quiet. I could feel fear rising in me. Not fear of the house. Fear that saying no might cost me the man who had offered it. So I explained. I need to know that if I ever walk through that door with my girls, it's because I chose this family, not because I couldn't afford another option. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then don't come until you know. He did not argue. He did not remind me how much easier life could be. After another quiet moment, he said, I don't want you here because you need a roof. I want you here when you no longer need rescuing." That was when I understood something I had spent years getting wrong. Independence wasn't proving I could live without anyone. It was reaching the point where love became a choice instead of an emergency. I could pay my rent now. I could feed my children. I could leave if something felt wrong. And because of that, staying with someone could finally mean something different. Over the next few weeks, Daniel changed nothing. He still brought Noah over. He still asked how my shifts were going. We still took the kids to the park and shared ordinary dinners. He never punished me for setting a boundary. He never became distant because I had said no. That mattered more than the house ever could. I had known men who treated love like permission to take control. Daniel treated love like something he had to keep earning. That was when I finally understood the difference between a man who wanted to possess a family and a man who was willing to earn his place in one. As the months passed, our lives began to fit together without anyone forcing them to. Daniel was no longer the man helping me through a difficult season. He was simply there. Noah looked out for Emily and Lucy at the playground. Emily helped Noah when he rushed through his homework. Lucy somehow turned every quiet afternoon into a game that required all three of them. None of it felt planned. That was what made it feel real. Daniel and I stopped needing long conversations about what we meant to each other. I noticed it in smaller things instead. He knew how I took my coffee. I knew when he was worried, even when he said he was fine. He remembered my work schedule. I remembered which nights Noah had school activities. Family was forming in routines before any of us gave it a name. One evening, after dinner at Daniel's house, the children fell asleep together on the sofa. Noah was in the middle. Lucy had one foot under his blanket. Emily was curled against the other end, still holding a book she had never finished. Daniel and I sat nearby. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me. "I love you." There was no ring, no speech, no promise of a perfect life. Just 4 words from a man who had spent months proving what they meant. Once, those words would have frightened me. This time, I let them stay. "I love you too." He leaned closer, slowly enough that I could have pulled away. I didn't. We kissed. A moment later, I heard movement from the sofa. Emily opened her eyes and looked at Daniel, then at me, then at Noah and Lucy. "Mommy, are we a family now?" I couldn't answer immediately. Daniel knelt beside her. "What do you think?" Emily considered it with the seriousness only a child can give a simple question. "I think we already are." Lucy woke up just enough to understand what was happening. "We are," she said. Noah opened his eyes last. When we explained, he smiled. "Then I have sisters." Something inside me settled. Blood can explain where we came from. It cannot guarantee who will stay. I had learned that difference the hard way. The man who helped create my daughters had chosen absence. Daniel had chosen presence, over and over again. Family, I finally understood, was less about who had a right to claim you and more about who accepted the responsibility of loving you. I watched the 3 children pull closer together on the sofa. A year after the night when I walked into Maple Street Diner with $20 in my pocket, we went back. The bell above the door of Maple Street Diner sounded exactly the way I remembered it. 1 year had passed since the night I walked in with $20 in my pocket and 2 hungry little girls beside me. This time, I came back with Emily, Lucy, Noah, and Daniel. No limousine waited outside. There was no private room, no expensive celebration. We slid into a booth near the same corner where my daughters and I had once shared a single plate. I opened the menu and caught myself adding prices in my head. Old habits leave slowly. I still worked, I still saved, I still checked our budget before buying anything extra. But the rent was paid. Our refrigerator had food in it. There was money in a small emergency account. And for the first time in years, I had choices. Lucy pointed to the chicken dinner. I want that one. I looked at the picture and remembered cutting nearly the same meal into 3 pieces. I remembered telling them, Mommy already ate. This time I ordered the chicken too. For myself. It was such a small thing, but I noticed it. I no longer had to turn sacrifice into dinner. Halfway through the meal, Noah stopped talking. He was looking toward another table. An older father sat there with a little boy. The man studied the bill, called the waitress over, and quietly asked her to remove dessert. Nothing dramatic happened. He was simply doing the same kind of math I once knew too well. Noah looked at Daniel. Before Daniel could say anything, I understood. Go ask them. Noah blinked. Really? Really. He slid out of the booth and walked toward their table. Daniel looked at me. I smiled. Someone once did it for us. For a long time, I thought Daniel changed my life. Because he had money. Looking back, that wasn't true. Money could have paid my rent for a month. It could have filled my refrigerator. What changed my life was harder to buy. Noah noticed us. Daniel respected me. Margaret gave me a fair chance. And eventually I learned to give myself one. I used to believe family was something you were born into. Now I know better. Family is built by people who show up, tell the truth, respect your dignity, and stay when staying requires something from them. Blood can create a connection. Actions create a home. If you had been in my place, would you have found the courage to trust again after being abandoned? And after everything the 5 of us went through, are you satisfied with the ending we found together?